Coming up on this episode of Flirtations, we're talking trauma with Tal Fish, a licensed mental health counselor, and together we're holding the space for an extremely important conversation. And just a heads up, this episode may be sensitive to some, especially if you have had trauma in your life, and I understand if you need to listen another time. This episode will always be here for you. As today, we'll be discussing what trauma really is, how we experience it, and how both our minds and bodies respond when we've been hurt. We'll talk about the coping mechanisms people often use and what it takes to start trusting people again. Plus, we'll go into how to handle moments when you feel overwhelmed. We're answering your dating questions too, of course, like how much to share and when, and how to communicate boundaries. And perhaps most importantly, we've got tips on how to hold on to hope and find healing as a survivor. So, whether you're someone healing from trauma, supporting a loved one, or just wanting to understand more, this conversation is for you. Let's do this, flirties.
I heard you wanted to flirt. I heard you wanted to flirt. I heard you wanted to flirt. Hello, my name is Benjamin. I'm the flirt coach and a gay Libra. Everyone has an inner flirt.
Hey, flirty.
Live, laugh, flirt.
Work the flirt.
Work the flirt. Delulu is the Salulu. Expert on the flirt.
Hey, flirty. There's always another flirt.
Everyone has an inner flirt. Get out of your head and into the flirt.
Flirties, we are bringing the trauma episode to you today. We have so much to get into, and you all came through with so many amazing and just really personal questions, and we can't wait to help guide you through this conversation today. Welcome to the show, Tal Fish. Hello.
Hi.
How you doing, Tal?
I'm doing well. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Happy you're here as well. I know you personally, but for the flirties that may be getting to know you for the first time today, if you could share a little bit more about yourself.
So I am a lifelong resident of North Carolina. I use he, him pronouns. I didn't say that up front. I'm a licensed clinical mental health counselor, and I work as a therapist. I currently work exclusively with university students in a university counseling center. So that is my only clientele at this time. I'm also a part-time professor for a graduate counseling program at Wake Forest University. When I am not working, I am also a yogi, not necessarily on your flirt coach's level, but I aspire to be there one day. I love to be outside. I love to go hiking. I love to read. I'm also a performer. I sing and I do theater. So I perform in my free time a good bit, which is something that really fills me up. So yeah, I think that's probably the most you need to know about me at this point. I've been a counselor for over a decade now. And weirdly enough, I love talking about trauma because I love helping people heal from trauma. So it's a really challenging, difficult, heavy topic, that deserves the respect of treating it with weight. And yet it's an exciting part of my clinical practice, helping people start to heal from really horrible experiences.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing more about yourself. Yeah, we got connected many, many years ago through a mutual friend back in high school. And I've seen you perform and sing. We've done some yoga together. So this is really cool now to, I think, experience the mental health professional side of Tal, which I don't really, right? Like we hang out, we do some yoga, we get coffee or something, but this is going to be, because like, as you said, it's, I think living today, it's probably likely that we're going to experience trauma at some point in our lives. How we experience that and what has happened to us is individual to each of us. But I really think we're going to take care of this conversation today. And right at the top, just want to ask you to bring some context to the word trauma. If there's a definition you use, or how might you explain it?
Yeah, when I think about trauma, and this might be several definitions kind of melded into one, but I do know it comes from research and evidence. This definition, Um, it's when there is an event that overwhelms our typical capacity for coping, and after which there is lasting impact. So oftentimes with trauma, we'll talk about a before and after.
Yeah.
There's significant and pervasive disruption in the person's life, mentally, emotionally, relationally, after this traumatic event. What's interesting about trauma is it has a lot to do with the survivor's perception. So two people could have the same experience of trauma and walk away with a different impact. So there's typical types of trauma that we hear about, such as violence, like assault, abuse. There's certainly more emotional types of trauma that people can experience in relationships. I think when it comes to what you do in the world of dating and relationships, so much of the trauma that shapes us happens in childhood as children in our families of origin. That can really kind of set the blueprint for our lives and our relationships in a lot of ways. So there's childhood trauma, there's adult trauma, there's trauma that comes from things like natural disasters. I think mass shootings, unfortunately, in our society have become, in a really awful, sad way, to become more expected. Gun violence would absolutely be a type of trauma that people experience. Anything related to the military, combat, there's all kinds of trauma that people can experience. I think the kinds of trauma that is probably most salient to like dating and relationships is relational trauma that happens between people. That tends to wound us in a way that creates problem down the line in future relationships.
So good. And I like right away that you're making this distinction. And that's a definition that I haven't heard before, but I love, and that's helping me understand what trauma is more. It's a complete overwhelming of your body's ability to just process what is happening. And it can happen. It's not just physical. It could be emotional. It could be psychological. So it's experiencing harm perhaps that, isn't just like someone touching you. It can happen, and you can experience trauma in multiple different ways. And so I want to ask you now, what are some of the ways that the body maybe deals with trauma in the moment? So like I'm familiar with fight, flight, freeze, fawn responses, as if this is a part of the of trauma, or how the body just reacts.
Yeah, so it's really amazing because the brain and the body have this like incredible way of helping us survive when we're experiencing trauma. That's where like disassociation comes in. People will like check out, escape, numb, just to endure, whatever trauma it is that they are being subjected to. Then we have the responses that you named, like fight, flight, freeze. I've heard that put as fight, flight, freeze, or appease. Which is the fawning response. People pleasing might be something that's developed through experiences of trauma. Like if I can just keep everybody happy, I'll be okay and I'll be safe. So that's how we might see like a more exaggerated fawn or appease reaction. I've heard it put that fight, flight, and freeze and appease are almost like personality styles, and we kind of have those defaults. Like I'm a little bit more of a fight, and I've been around other people that were definitely more of a freeze. I think it's important for survivors to understand the freeze reaction, because oftentimes they will say, I wish I had said something, I wish I had done something, why wasn't I able to scream or to get out of there? And the body is quite literally frozen in fear, trying to keep that person alive. And so that can help the survivor to be a little bit more self-compassionate, understanding the function of that freeze response.
Yeah. And what are some, I want to stay with this a moment more, some ways that maybe trauma gets stored in the body, or how the body just then responds to that trauma post the trauma itself. Or if you're someone that is experiencing repeat traumas, if you're in a relationship, or maybe you grew up in a household that was really dysfunctional and there's some not so great things happening and you're experiencing a trauma over and over and over again, if like the effects of it compound or how someone starts to cope with that.
I'm certainly no expert when it comes to answering this question, but one of the most famous books about trauma today is called The Body Keeps the Score.
Yeah.
And so those emotional experiences definitely get stored and remembered in the body. And trauma memory gets stuck in a way that regular memory doesn't. Because our typical capabilities for coping are overwhelmed.
Yeah.
The traumatic experience is not being processed in the same way as other experiences that we have throughout any given day. So that's why when a person is triggered, they feel like it's happening right now or like it just happened because the memory has not actually gone into long-term memory. It's kind of in this in-between stuck place. So that's why folks tend to re-experience trauma, relive trauma, have flashbacks because it's gotten stuck. So a lot of trauma therapy is about letting that memory live in the past, you know, where it belongs, letting that memory be stored in long-term memory.
That's really interesting. And what are some
the other
some
thing
of the
I was going to
ways?
say, the other thing I was going to say that's really fascinating is trauma survivors have presented, you know, to physicians, to medical doctors with somatic physical concerns that have later been alleviated once the person began trauma therapy. So trauma can quite literally make a person sick. It can compromise the immune system. There are cognitive impacts to how a person can think and communicate clearly or not based on their traumatic experience. So, I mean, the impact is really pervasive, meaning it impacts a person holistically.
Yeah. Really speaking to this experience of trauma, that it impacts, like whether it is a physical or emotional or, you know, no matter what form of trauma it is, I think you're really speaking to this experience that it affects the body as in all of its systems, right? So you may start to experience things, and like not necessarily saying like, oh, now you're having anxiety or this thing happened or your autoimmune disease is flaring up, to say specifically pointing the finger, it was related or rooted in trauma. But I think a lot of us have experienced those just symptoms and things in our life that are like, it's getting worse when we're stressed or when we're experiencing something traumatic. And this is just like, I find like we have to give ourselves so much compassion that our body is just doing the best it can to keep us alive and to keep us safe.
Absolutely. That's one of my favorite truths to return to in therapy, is that we all are just doing the best we can.
Yeah.
Now, in this context, that's not to make excuses for abusers. So let me be very clear about that separation.
Yes.
But trauma survivors tend to have developed negative beliefs about themselves. So I think self-compassion is really important as part of that healing journey, and unlearning, you know, the negative beliefs that were taught through traumatic experience, so that person can come to be kinder and gentler with themselves.
Absolutely. And I have a question here now from a flirty who was sharing an experience of trauma from a relationship. And they were describing that it's like, I feel like this changed me. Like, I feel like I'm just not the same person that I was before. And I'm having a hard time rationalizing that in my brain.
Yeah. So, I mean, what I go to immediately when I hear that is grief. You know, this person is grieving what was lost to traumatic experience. They're grieving, you know, who they were before the trauma. They're grieving that they had to go through it at all, you know, that it happened. They're Yeah. And so I think that's why that's tough to reconcile with, because grief is a really painful emotion. And I'm actually glad that this question was brought up, because grief and trauma really go hand in hand. You
Mm-hmm.
know, with almost any kind of trauma you could think of, there's always some kind of loss, whether it be tangible or intangible. You know,
Yeah.
loss of safety, loss of connection, loss of self.
Yeah.
Um, so there's grief work that is really like right tied up together with trauma work. And sometimes that's what people have been avoiding because that grief feels so heavy.
Yeah. What are some, I want to stay here for a moment, some strategies, maybe one or two things that someone could do to start to embody their healing and to just process maybe and bring in some grief work to their lives?
Yeah, I think if they can find, a safe person
Mm,
to, it could be a therapist, but not necessarily. I mean, if they have a trusted friend, just to tell the story and really name what was lost and maybe let themselves start to feel feelings that have been repressed,
yeah.
start to move through that grief, because we call it a process for a reason. And oftentimes, we've received blocking messages that kind of interrupt that process. So really just kind of letting the grief flow naturally. When I
Yeah.
used to work with grief with clients, we would say, don't try to make anything happen, but don't try to stop anything from happening either. Just
Mm-hmm.
kind of being present for what is. Um, I mean, there's all kinds of, I think, like rituals people can engage in for like letting go or saying goodbye if that feels
Yeah.
important or meaningful.
Yeah.
I love letter writing. There's lots of
Mm-hmm.
things you can do with letter writing, to your younger self or to parts of
Mm.
self or to the person or the thing that's been lost. But yeah, grief is another one of my favorite areas of focus in counseling, just because it's so core to the human condition.
Yeah. Really speaking to this loss of self that you may have experienced during that trauma. It could be loss of, gosh, even maybe some innocence there. Like there's,
Mhm.
that could be a big part of it. I'm curious
Loss of
now.
trust.
Yes. Oh my gosh, loss of trust. And that's a
Thinking
bit. We
about
got
this dialogue with dating and whatnot.
Yeah, we got some definite questions we're going to get to about how to trust people again, right? Let your walls down, so to speak, and be
And I do
vulnerable.
not have a magic
Especially,
answer because I am still working on that
it's
myself.
oh my gosh, are we all? Yes, a lifetime this takes, especially if you experience a trauma. I want to ask you now just some different ways that people cope with it. I think you mentioned the people pleasing a little bit earlier. If it's someone that has that appease type of response to a trauma, the disassociation, even emotional
Mhm.
numbing, I think probably drugs and alcohol can be a
Mhm.
definite coping mechanism. But some different ways that people may just cope with it, just start to process it, as best they can.
You just named so many. I feel like
Mm.
I want to turn the question back at you because
Oh,
you
uh-huh.
you described it so well. But I was trying to think about things you didn't say.
Hmm.
And I think people, this is, addiction can look like so many things and we can
Yes.
numb out with so many things. Some people might cope with it through work,
Yep. Yep.
through, staying so busy that they never really have time to think or to feel. We can make any kind of like positive behavior into a numbing behavior with the right intention.
Yes.
So I would say kind of anything that supports avoidance of emotion, also quite literally avoidance of like triggers or cues or reminders for the trauma, maybe like
Right.
avoiding certain people, places, things. Um, but you named so many good ones. You talked about disassociation, and that is when a person kind of mentally, not on purpose, kind of checks out, just sort of goes away when they are encountering overwhelming emotion. And it's also
Yes.
what happens during the trauma if it's so bad that the person
Mm.
can't really stay present for it.
Hmm.
So it's survival. And that's the thing. A lot of trauma reactions are rooted in survival. Like hypervigilance is a big one, kind of staying
Hmm.
on high alert for the next threat.
Yes. Yes.
And traumatic experience teaches people, you need to watch out. You need to be on the lookout. So people think like it's my job to make sure this doesn't happen again.
Right.
So much anxiety. Anxiety is a huge product of trauma. Sometimes any kind of numbing, avoidance. Yeah, I mean, feel like you said one or two that I didn't repeat just now. Your list was
Yeah.
good.
The hypervigilance I was also thinking of as well. It's like you start to develop this response and it's just, you're just on high alert all the time. It's like your nervous system is always on. You're scanning for danger. You don't even
Yeah.
feel comfortable with yourself. And so you may, like you said, just throw yourself into work or a new relationship or a new hobby or something just to avoid. I think the key word is avoidant that you mentioned. Just avoid being with yourself because it's uncomfortable, it's painful, it hurts. It's just that kind of that feeling of overwhelm persists even after the trauma is over.
Yeah. There's another experience like grief that is really closely connected to trauma, and that's shame. And I don't know why I just thought about that, but something you said made me think about shame just now.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a big part of the survivor's work, is healing from that sense of shame. I know what it was, because a lot of the time people will develop the belief that it was their fault, or that they should have done something, or they should have been able to stop it.
Yeah.
And so that experience of shame is so common. And so I think that's a lot of what shows up as wounds in relationships, is people with like unhealed shame that's bubbling up as conflict between two people.
Yeah. I think so too. And now let's start to, I've got some questions here from the flirties who are dating and have experienced the trauma in their childhood and a past relationship at some point in their life. And I know they're carrying this with them into the dating process. So let's get into some dating questions now. The first one being about trauma bonding. Like if that is maybe a pattern for you, or if that is maybe the dating behavior that you're really leaning into now. If you could speak a little bit to trauma bonding and what that is, because it's the term that gets thrown around a lot, and I don't think it's used correctly most of the time.
So I might actually like kind of debunk its popular use right now, because my therapist was just telling me about this the other day. It's actually when a person develops an attachment to their abuser.
Okay.
What did you think it was, or what do you think people often are saying when they are meaning when they say that?
I oftentimes hear get used in the ways where you're dating, right? You're forming connections, making relationships, and it's like you're repeating a pattern or you're repeating a cycle. So if you were abused in a previous relationship, or even by, let's say, a parent, you sort of have that become your model for love. Yes. And so then you seek out that same type of what is abuse, but treatment by someone you're dating as, oh, this is what love looks like. Or now if you're wrapped up, really caught, stuck in a trauma response, appeasing, fawning, people pleasing. And so this just becomes your identity in so many ways. And it's so deeply rooted. And so you trauma bond in relationships, even though they may not be with your existing or your initial abuser, let's say. Yeah. But you seek that out.
I think what you just said is spot on. And the word that I often use for that is blueprint. Like if I have experienced abuse, if I experience neglect, especially in childhood, that's going to become the blueprint for what I come to expect in relationships. Yeah. And then if that's repeated over time, it never becomes comfortable, but it does become familiar. And so to some extent, the brain is wired to seek out what's familiar. And so I think that's part of why we see people repeat patterns. And it's really easy, if you haven't experienced that kind of trauma, to say like, what's wrong with them? How could they possibly end up in a relationship like this again? Yeah. They've done studies that have proven when people have survived trauma, their ability to like detect red flags is inhibited. I think that I am correctly paraphrasing that, which is really sad, and also just like really explains that very well, like how a person can find themselves in that cycle. I think there's a lot of shame, and sometimes people think that they don't deserve any better. it's a lot of kind of self-limiting beliefs that contribute to that pattern.
Absolutely. Yeah, for the flirty that is maybe repeating some patterns, or they're not able to see the red flags in some of the people we're dating. I mean, I think my question is here, because we're all bringing some type of pain, heartbreak, not necessarily trauma, but a lifetime of experiences into dating. And for the flirty that is bringing some trauma into it, how can you um, protect yourself and still put yourself out there to get to know somebody?
My therapist has this really beautiful analogy of like
Mm-hmm.
letting people in slowly over time.
Mm-hmm.
Because I also think for some people who have experienced a lot of intensity in their lives, they kind of
Mm-hmm.
dive into the deep end really quickly when getting to know
Yes.
somebody.
Yes.
And she has this metaphor. It's a house, like initially somebody's going to be in my front yard and I'll talk to them there and we'll have a like nice chit chat, small talk conversation. Then maybe they come to my front porch. We go a little deeper. Then they're in my living room, after trust builds over time. And
Yeah.
eventually, bedroom, not just meaning sex, but kind of like the like final layer of vulnerability.
Yeah.
So like letting bonds develop, in a like well-paced kind of slower capacity so that
Mm-hmm.
people aren't rushing into things. I'm losing my train of thought for what I wanted to say next, because repeat your question again?
Well, no, I'm really glad you're answering it in this way, because my question kind of didn't have anything to do with what I was saying. As I was thinking in the moment, for the like, if it's like you don't know what you don't know, and if you're repeating those patterns, if you are
Oh,
unsure of what red flags to look for, it's
yeah.
like you may not see them, like you may not see what's right in front of you. But I really like what you're sharing here, and this is something that I think a lot of people that have experienced trauma do, is they do rush in head first. They dive into the deep end and they tend to overshare and just put it all out there very, very quickly. And so I'm glad you answered the question in this way, because I want to really just empower the flirties to keep a few of their cards close to their chest.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. When it comes to like difficulty seeing red flags or, continuing to repeat cycles, I just think about the importance of having accountability people. I mean,
Yeah.
like, I'm a licensed therapist, and there were aspects of my last relationship where I was experiencing emotional abuse. And
Mm.
if it weren't for my therapist, I was not really seeing that at the time.
Yeah. Okay.
So, I mean, I think we all have our blind spots, like, no matter our, training and expertise, or no
For
matter,
sure.
how well we think we know each other or know ourselves. Um, I just think about all the good friends I've had over the
Mm.
years who have
Hmm.
supported me through difficult relationships and been like, hey, like, this is really not okay,
Hmm.
like, so I guess what I'm getting at there is not being in isolation with a relationship.
Yeah.
Like, if
That's
I'm starting
important.
to feel like I can't tell anybody what's going on here, or
Yeah.
like, what are people going to think if I tell them what's happening? Like that's probably a red flag. So like,
Yeah.
how openly can I share about what's going on in my relationship?
Mm. That's so good to not date in isolation, and keep your support systems active, especially if you are maybe coming from a relationship that was abusive and they've tried to isolate you and you've withdrawn. Take some time to build up those support systems, seek out help from professionals even, and just know it's like, yeah, I've been in relationships too that haven't been traumatic or abusive, but there've been those things, and especially it, you really like them, and
Mhm.
you don't see maybe what's right in front of you. So having that third party, some outside perspective, can be really, really helpful. And I think, okay, yeah, let's ask this question. Kind of going back to one of the coping mechanisms. This one comes from a flirty who says, "Look, like I'm just really hypervigilant and have a hard time trusting people because of my last relationship. How can I, all right, protect myself but still learn to trust someone again?"
I think what we have to get to is I'm going to be okay even if I get hurt again. Now, hopefully it won't be, as bad or in the same way or at all if
Right.
things work out wonderfully.
Right.
But I think if I'm entering into it saying like, we've got to have this kind of core trust that I'm going to be okay regardless, and that I can survive the risk of opening myself up to experiencing love, because I think it's risky for all of us, right? Survivor
Absolutely.
or not, to become vulnerable in a relationship, to risk intimacy and that level of connection. I hope I got at that. And I hope that doesn't sound minimizing of the hypervigilance that's there, because I am a person who at this recording is not on the apps because I am avoiding that. So I completely get the hypervigilance after a bad run of things. But yeah, I think it's developing enough like self-trust and groundedness in who I am, that if it doesn't work out again, that'll be okay.
Yeah.
And believing, that if I have experience harm in relationship, that I can set boundaries today, that I can communicate assertively, or I can learn to do those things if I don't know how to do those things, so that I can have sort of a more empowered mindset where like I have more control in my, dating and romantic life. I'm saying all things that I need to hear right now. So thank you for having me on your show.
I think you answered it beautifully. It's like you first learn to trust others by trusting yourself and building that self-trust and deepening the connection with yourself, that you are going to be okay. Just having that groundedness and that resilience within yourself can then allow you to open up over time, right? They're starting in the yard, then you let them in the front door. We're hanging out in the living room. I think that analogy is so helpful here. There's no rush. When you're out there dating, there's no need to put it all out there right away. And then you get to rely on, call back to you, your boundaries, right? All of that good stuff. That's like, hey, this is the pace that is comfortable for me. This is what I'm comfortable sharing, and communicating where you're at and communicating your boundaries as well. So I think really, really helpful for the Florida to answer that question. Let's ask.
Another thing I might say to that person with the hypervigilance, just to kind of like slowly over time in ways that feel safe to this person, kind of to expose that anxiety and say, like, it's worth it to me to experience love, to feel this fear. Like remembering kind of what the goal is or what the value is. That makes, facing that fear meaningful. And I think that can be really helpful for a lot of people. Like, if I've got social anxiety, but I want to find a partner, like, it's worth me confronting this social anxiety and feeling uncomfortable for the hope of finding a partner.
Absolutely.
I really like to frame things that way.
Oh, I love that one myself, Tal. I'm taking that one. I'm putting that in my dating handbook right now, my personal dating handbook.
We both got something tonight.
Yeah, excellent. We did. Healing one another in real time.
That's great.
So I think that was for the flirty that is looking to date again, or they're already starting to date again. And so now I have a question from a flirty who's having trouble letting go and moving on. They're like, I still have even some affection for the person that hurt me, for the person that caused me trauma. How I have some shame and guilt around this, some confusion. How do I start to let go, and maybe why I'm feeling this way?
I'm so glad this question was asked, because as I said earlier, I like to talk about grief, and it's really important to know that we can grieve toxic relationships. And I use toxic pretty intentionally, not in the way that it gets thrown around, everywhere you look these days. No offense if you use toxic.
I don't.
I just feel like it's like everywhere you look, like everyone's
truly
toxic
is
now. But back to what I was saying. We can absolutely grieve toxic relationships, because even in a relationship where there was harm, I don't mean to romanticize an abusive relationship, but there could still have been things you loved about this person or that you loved about your time together.
Yeah.
And so it's normal for there to be grief, even if intellectually your brain is telling you you shouldn't be grieving this person, they hurt you.
Yeah.
Your emotional being doesn't know that.
Yeah.
And so as weird as it might seem, kind of let that grief be there while, being really clear on not tolerating that kind of behavior in future relationships. And I don't mean to victim blame when I say that. I just mean to kind of set the new standard for,
Yeah.
what's acceptable and what's not in a new relationship, having learned and grown through this experience.
I think that's a really important perspective for so many of the Floridians to hear, that you can also grieve a relationship that wasn't exactly healthy, right? In the long run, there were still things that you maybe really liked about this person. There could have been some love there. Yeah. And sometimes we feel really embarrassed even, and just ashamed that we are having this grief for a person that did us so much harm.
Well, and I think what makes it harder too is oftentimes friends will be like, oh, like that person sucks. Like, stop talking about them. They were so bad for you. And so then you do feel kind of like judged for it a little bit. And like, and friends and family and loved ones, they might be trying to help, but I think sometimes it can come across not so helpful.
Right. Yeah, I think so too. I want to ask you now this question that came through about, so let's say you're starting to date someone new. It's maybe been that first date, a first few dates, and you feel like you're doing pretty good. Things are going well, and you get triggered. How can you move through that situation? And would this be something, even though it's relatively new, you might just communicate how you're feeling too?
It's a tough question because I think being triggered could look like so many different things potentially.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if the question is really about how would I communicate what was happening to my new dating partner, or how I would kind of address that.
Perhaps. I think, let's take the question that direction.
Okay. Because first and foremost, I would want the person to do whatever they, have in their toolkit to ground, working with the senses, doing some deep breathing. Maybe this is something where, you and a therapist have developed kind of some go-tos that you can do if you get triggered. So if you're out on a date, you can say like, hey, excuse me, I'm just going to step outside and get some fresh air or something.
Yeah.
And then you can do whatever you need to do to kind of bring yourself back.
Yeah.
I would actually advise that. That's kind of called coping ahead. If you are a person with trauma, like to say like, okay, what will I do?
Okay.
How will I say like, I'm going to step out for a minute, or I'm going to run to the restroom and I'll be right back.
Yeah.
So I think it's okay to give yourself that space to kind of do whatever you need to do to cope in that moment. I think, as trust develops organically over time and you feel like you want to share parts of your story with this person, I think that's okay, as long as there's a foundation of safety there. As long as you're not rushing into, like oversharing. I don't know that there's a specific timeline on this, but intimacy is really something that that develops over time and takes some space to really bloom. And so just being mindful that it's your story and that's delicate. Not that you're fragile, but that, it's worth being cautious about who you share it with.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that response. And the only thing I would really add here is not to, like, sometimes not to sacrifice your own boundaries in the moment, or not to feel like you have to offer excuses for yourself to someone. Like, it's going to come over time, especially if speaking up for yourself and really just standing your ground in the moment has been really difficult. If you felt like you've been ignored in the past, or you've tried to do that and it just didn't make a difference, still finding the empowerment to, if someone maybe is moving towards physical touch on a date and you're just not comfortable with that, you're just not there yet, you get to say, hey, I'm not comfortable with that. Like,
that could be it. You don't have to offer an excuse. You don't have to offer a reason or a justification. You don't have to offer
Yeah.
a why. I'm just not comfortable. I'm not there yet.
I am so glad you said that, because absolutely it takes me back to the like no is a complete sentence that I love so
Absolutely. Yes.
much.
Mm-hmm.
Um, on a tangent, but on a tangent I think is
Yeah.
worthwhile. I think I got this from my therapist too, but she talks about how a lot of people misuse trigger too, and
Mm.
will say I was triggered when what they really mean is I had an uncomfortable emotional experience.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I think we want to get real clear on like when we're saying triggered, do we mean that there's some discomfort, or do we mean that like my trauma has been activated and that like I'm,
Right.
I'm having a flashback, I'm having a panic attack, and I'm reliving, what's happened to me in the past. And
Yeah.
this is not to make anybody feel bad or to be the language police, but I think what gets lost if we say, that just an uncomfortable emotional experience is being triggered is the opportunity to learn how to cope with that and be with it.
Mm.
And to
Mm-hmm.
kind of normalize that a little bit more too, not to
Yeah.
normalize trauma. That's not what I mean, but to
Right.
normalize discomfort, because inevitably as humans, we're going to experience discomfort. So that's my
Absolutely.
little kind of like side note on triggered.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction again, because we're using some terminology here in this conversation that you see if you're on social media, you see all over the place: trauma bonding, maybe even hypervigilance, words like codependence and being
Mhm.
triggered. But if we can give some context and some more kind of distinct meaning to these words, yeah, you having some anxiety because someone didn't text you back after 2 hours, like that's you're having some anxiety. It's not comfortable, perhaps not enjoyable, but truly a triggering experience, reactivating your trauma. I think, yes, giving some more concrete language to the actual experience. And sometimes it just is uncomfortable, or like you're
Yeah.
going on a first date. Everyone's nervous. Yes,
Yeah,
everybody.
yeah.
Hmm.
So much of what I do as a counselor is just normalize human experiences. It's like, yeah,
Yeah.
of course you felt that way. Just
Hmm.
'cause we don't really live in a society that does that. And that is something that's really important for trauma survivors, is to have their experiences validated.
Oh my gosh.
Because a
Yes.
lot of times trauma is what happens when there is no empathetic witness. I forget there's a specific writer that's attributed to.
Hmm.
And so, really being seen and heard and understood fully are
Yeah.
such important needs. And for a lot of survivors, feeling seen can feel scary.
Mm.
So, it's the whole relational paradox, like I want to be known, but when I'm
Yeah.
known, I get hurt. And so, there's that dance.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is going to be a conversation I'm going to listen back to as someone that's experienced trauma in my life. I'm seeing a lot of myself in this conversation, and I can relate to a lot of the coping mechanisms we talked about, a lot of the ways the body reacts to trauma. And what's coming to mind from what you just said is, I'm not looking for an apology or something like that, having really practiced acceptance now, but just to be acknowledged, right? Just to be validated that this, something happened, um, and that you're on the other side, right? We're survivors, right? If you've
Mhm.
been through something traumatic, just to have someone acknowledge your experience and how much strength and courage it took to get through that.
Yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely. It's very important.
I've got a message here from a flirty that I'm gonna read part of it, and then we'll talk about it for a moment. And this flirty says, "It's really scary to try to meet someone new and attempt a quote unquote normal interaction. I'll know I'll eventually be kissed again and have intimate relationships, but the anxiety and fear that occurs because of the abuse I experienced in my previous relationship stops me in my tracks sometimes. I know what happened wasn't my fault, but overcoming the thoughts and feelings that it is or was my fault is very difficult."
Yeah.
Um, and the question here is how to move forward. I think we've been talking to that experience throughout this episode, but I received this DM and just um,
Yeah, I really wanted to bring it to the conversation today.
Yeah. I know I talked about, like gradually opening up to a new
Mm-hmm.
partner.
Mm-hmm.
And with this question, I am thinking about maybe the importance of communicating with, this person's next partner and just like letting them know a little bit of the history,
Yeah.
what they're working through, and how they could best be supportive and how
Yeah.
they could contribute to a sense of safety.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm glad that that came up, the word safety, because I think another definition of trauma could be like a dramatic lack of safety or removal
Mm.
of safety,
Mm-hmm.
or an event that suddenly jeopardizes safety,
Yeah. Yeah.
whether that be mental, physical, emotional. And so I mean, I think about communicating and kind of working with this partner
Yeah.
to determine kind of like what makes them feel safe, what their boundaries are, how they best communicate, just like being super intentional in all those ways. Cause it sounded like this person was maybe was dating already or starting to date.
Starting to. They're
Starting
kind
to,
of,
okay.
yeah, in that early phase where it's even making the one part I didn't read, but it's even scary making eye contact with people. Like
Mm,
that's where we're starting from, is just
yeah.
learning to acknowledge someone and in turn be seen, right? This is a part of the experience in the flirt that I talk about that some people if maybe you've experienced trauma or you have anxiety can have trouble with. It's like maybe flirting with or acknowledging someone, that may be the part that comes more naturally. But then when it comes back on you, receiving that attention, receiving
Mhm.
the flirt back is where things could get a little tricky, perhaps. But I love what you were saying. And it's just the cool thing about healing and that it can happen relationally is you then get to heal in other relationships with your friends, with a
Mhm.
therapist, with
Mhm.
my goodness, just people that you can begin to bring into your life that you can start to trust.
Yeah.
Not
It
feeling like
sounds
you
like
have
that
to,
person.
yeah, go through this alone.
Yeah. It sounds like that person, like you said, with even like making eye contact, that they're kind of baby step by baby step risking new exposure. They're like, okay,
Mm.
now I'm willing to look somebody in the eye. And so I would say like it's okay to take it at your own pace too.
Yes. Yes.
As you're cultivating a sense of safety
Yeah.
for you, nothing has to be rushed. And it sounds like you talk about this and your like broader guidance with folks, which is awesome. Because I do think there is, because of our like immediate access to each other these days, it does seem like there's this like we go on one date and it's like, what are we?
Yes.
There's
Yes.
this like
Yes.
pressure to, yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. That is an experience that happens nowadays. I think speaking to that, just immediate access, wanting immediate gratification in many ways, just from being on the apps and things. But oh my gosh, another conversation
Yeah.
for another day. As
Uh-huh.
we're getting towards the end here, these conversations go so quickly. I think the only maybe one or two more questions. This one here is where some flirties could go to for support, some resources. We'll have some things listed in the show notes as well, because one thing we haven't spoken to is the more specifically the mental health aspect of this. So something
Mhm.
traumatic happens to you and you never had anxiety before, and all of a sudden you have what feels like an anxiety disorder, or you've
Yeah.
developed PTSD, CPSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, right? You're really struggling with your mental health, and need support, need help, need resources of some kind. So beyond this conversation today, where could someone start?
I would encourage somebody that has the opportunity to do so to get connected with a counselor or therapist
Mm-hmm.
that is trained in treating trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to see somebody that's trained in treating trauma to make sure that they do not inadvertently re-traumatize you. There are
Mm,
specific kind of ways of working clinically that ensure that that doesn't happen.
Yeah.
I do know that therapy is a luxury that not everybody can afford. There are therapists that do afford or that do accept like sliding scale fees.
Yeah.
And then if you live near a college or a university, there might be some kind of graduate student clinic where you could go get therapy at a reduced cost. There are also wonderful workbooks that are on Amazon for all kinds of like mental health needs and emotional healing.
Yeah.
And if you go on there, and I don't have a particular one off the top of my head, but can find one that's pretty well reviewed, that's probably a fairly safe bet. If you want to kind of do some work on your own, if you don't really have access to a therapist. However, if you're doing work on your own and your trauma history is pretty extensive, be careful, because you also don't want to inadvertently hurt yourself by pushing yourself too far. So really try to listen to yourself and know what your limits are for any healing work that you're trying to do. I mean, I think that's important for all of us, but certainly if you are lacking the support of like a therapist or good friends, but honestly, if you have safe and supportive friends that you can tell your story to, that are going to witness you with empathy and compassion and love, and you've not had that experience, that can be incredibly healing, if you're sure that these are safe people. And then also reconnecting with your body. Yoga is actually a really powerful trauma treatment modality, which not a lot of people realize. The mind-body connection and, being in the present moment and, the kind of focus and concentration that's required, all of that works to help a person reconnect with themselves physically in a way that's really powerful. But that's certainly not the only modality, but anything to move, to reconnect with your passions, and also just to connect, because trauma puts people in isolation. They feel like nobody understands me. Nobody's had it, this bad. I can't tell anybody what's happened. So just emphasizing relationships, period, friendships, supportive relationships of any kind, just so that you can start to feel less isolated, less alone, and hopefully with some people that can validate your experience.
Wow. So good. And one of the many reasons I do yoga personally and now love to teach it, it's being able to move through our own healing. And something I always try and do is just hold the space, whatever you need to do, bring it all here. I got you, right? Just breathe through it all and you're going to be okay. Tal Fish, this has been absolutely incredible. The only other question I have for you is any final words of wisdom, parting advice for the Flirties, and if they'd like to connect with you, how they could do that.
Yes. Oh, there's so many things I would want to say at the end of a conversation like this. I was my brain's going in like 100 different directions. Just that, healing is possible, and that your experiences, while they may become a part of you, don't have to define you. That everyone deserves safety and love and connection. Yeah, I hope there was something beneficial about this conversation that somebody can take away and be helped by. But to never give up on themselves and to maintain hope no matter what, because I think trauma can make things feel pretty hopeless too. It's speaking of loss, with trauma, I think loss of hope is one that there can be. That's probably all I would say. And you can connect with me. I pretty much only use Instagram, and it's Tal Fish. So please find me there, give me a follow, and maybe that will inspire me to talk more about mental health stuff on there, because I kind of just use it like Facebook in 2009.
Fantastic, Tal. I'll send the Flirties your way, and I think those are fantastic parting words for them. I think many, many pieces of wisdom that are going to benefit anyone in their healing journey, whether they've experienced a trauma in their life or not. So, Tal Fish, thank you so much for being a part of the show today.
I loved our conversation. Thank you for having me, and thank you for listening, everyone.
Flirties, that's a wrap on this episode of Flirtations, thank you so much for listening. Thank you to our guest for this conversation, Tal Fish, and thank you to you again for just allowing us to have this conversation and for trusting us to guide you through it. We really appreciate it. We approach this with a lot of empathy and just really wanting to be here and meet you exactly where you're at. So from both of us, we hope this was sincerely helpful for you. All right. Thank you again for listening, for tuning, for streaming, all the things, rating, reviewing, subscribing, sharing the show with a friend, following along on the socials. Yes, it all means just so much to me, and I thank you so much. All right, officially signing off here at Flirt Headquarters. My name is Benjamin. I'm the Flirt Coach and Gay Libra. Flirty. Happy flirting.